The restaurant hummed with its own weather, silverware chiming like rain, low laughter like distant thunder, the careful choreography of servers gliding between candlelight and linen. At the center of that controlled storm sat a man whose name was printed in headlines and whose life had been measured in acquisitions and audits. Daniel watched the room as if it were a market. Everything had a price, a margin, a predictable outcome. Beside him, Clara's hands lay folded over a shawl, the wheelchair's dark frame a quiet punctuation mark amid crystal and gilt. Her eyes followed the movement of the plates. She ate little, smiling with the economy of someone who kept reserves of joy for days when the body could no longer be trusted. Then the evening altered, in a way no balance sheet could predict. A small figure approached the table with the hesitant bravery of someone who habitually negotiated rejection. She was thin, hair gathered in a careless braid, hands darkened at the nails from weather and work that never paid enough to count. She did not reach for coins. She did not unfold a sign. She stood, and, with a voice that fit inside the hush between courses, said, "Feed me, and I'll heal your wife." Around them, the murmur stiffened into attention. Daniel felt the sentence as if someone had set a cold palm against his sternum. The words were simple, unadorned, almost obscene in their specificity. "Feed me, and I'll heal your wife." He laughed, because what else does a man trained to collect evidence do when confronted with a claim that refuses to be measured? The restaurant manager appeared at his elbow, face lined with the thin politeness that keeps expensive places tidy. "Please, miss," the manager began, the words smooth as a tray. "We cannot have this." Clara cut the manager off with a look that belonged to a different economy. Hope, not shame, had sharpened her voice. She reached, and her fingers found Daniel's under the table. "Let her sit," she said. "Please." There was softness there, but beneath it the iron certainty of someone who had lived long enough to know the value of a single request. The manager hesitated, measuring the risk of upsetting a patron who could make a call and empty a dining room with a single phrase. Daniel felt the whisper of power, the old muscle memory of decision-making, an instant to exercise judgment, to opt for convenience or for compassion. He chose convenience first. His scoff came fast and cold, but the sight of Clara's face, lit by candlelight and hope, stopped him more effectively than any restraint. Daniel agreed to a single piece of bread. He could not imagine that such a small thing might be the hinge of anything important. The waiter returned with a rustic roll, warm and fragrant, its crust trembling with steam. The girl accepted it with both hands, as if it were both offering and sacrament.
She tore the bread with care, each piece treated like a promise, and ate as if it had been a long time since her lips knew kindness. She ate slowly. Daniel watched the texture of the crust give way to soft white, the way crumbs caught in the corners of her mouth like tiny constellations. She finished, and then, without ceremony, reached to lay a palm on Clara's knee. The touch was cool, surprisingly steady. "Tomorrow," she said, looking straight at Clara, "you will know the truth." There was no flourish of wings, no booming voice, just a small human hand and a sentence that planted itself like a seed. Outside the walls of that elegant room, the city continued as always, lights in windows, late buses coughing their tired routes. But inside, the ordinary order had cracked. The manager murmured about bills and clientele. Daniel's friends smiled politely, practicing the art of not knowing how to respond to claims that did not touch a ledger. Daniel felt irritation like a second skin. He had not lost the habit of measuring truth, of demanding receipts for miracles. He had built his life on certainty, on operations that yielded consistent returns. This was not an investment he could assess. Still, when they left the restaurant that night, Clara's fingers tightened on his arm in the way he had not felt in months. She slept little, eyes wide under the lamplight, turning possibilities like coins in a pocket. Daniel went to bed with the argument in his chest, skepticism on one shoulder, curiosity on the other. Old memories surfaced in unexpected fragments, his mother leaving cupboards full but the table empty, because pride wouldn't let them ask. The first time he learned that hunger could be both physical and a quieter, uglier hollow. He felt a tightness that had nothing to do with the numbers of his bank. It was fear, maybe, and something like shame. The night stretched long. Clara woke once, whispering the girl's name as if calling someone in a dream. Daniel, who had grown used to controlling outcomes, felt the ragged edges of helplessness. He paced a circle of his own making, and then sat on the edge of their bed, looking at the ceiling where the plaster was imperfect, where a small crack had spidered the way a life sometimes did when pressure accumulated. He remembered the girl's hands, steady, not theatrical, and a strange, not entirely unwelcome expectation settled over the room. At dawn, the small miracle announced itself not with trumpets, but with a sound like someone rediscovering a language. Clara's voice rose, piercing the fragile quiet. "Daniel." The name was a long note. He hurried to her side. The chair was empty. Her legs, still 4 months earlier strangers to sensation, rippled with movement. She sat up, the motion hesitant, almost tentative, as if testing whether a borrowed mobility might betray them both. Her eyes filled with light, and there was the startled, ridiculous joy of a child first learning to run.
Daniel felt the floor shift under him. He crouched down, hands going to the place the girl had touched, and for a suspended moment allowed the possibility, impossible, unmeasured, to exist without collecting evidence. Clara laughed, a sound so clean it left no room for cynicism. The world smelled different that morning. Coffee, cold air, the thin metallic scent of a city waking up. He stood very still, swallowed by the enormity of not knowing how to classify what had happened. When the girl returned that afternoon, no parade, no announcement, she looked almost smaller in daylight, as if the day could dispel the mystery, as if she might be judged for her claim. Daniel met her in the courtyard by the service entrance, a place where the garbage bins were lined up like sentries, and the staff took their cigarette breaks. He expected a demand for money or a confession. Instead, she spoke in the same unadorned voice. "I didn't want money," she said. "I wanted you to see the inside of what you throw away." Her eyes were steady, not accusatory, but exact. She told them that she had watched the kitchen doors open at the end of every night and saw food, good food, parceled into bins or puddles of discarded opportunity. "There is dignity in being fed," she said. "There is nothing in the world that belongs to only one person. If you can give without being asked, you give your heart back a little." Daniel's reaction was messy. Anger, embarrassment, defensive rationales bubbling up like an old habit. He had systems, spreadsheets, counsel, practicalities that could explain away a child's moral counsel. But under the rhetoric, with the warmth of Clara's hand in his, a fissure widened. The life he had built protected a narrow band around comfort and efficiency. It had never forced him to reckon with the accumulated consequences of convenience, the restaurants that swept away leftovers, the contracts that prioritized profits over people, the staff trained to look away. The girl's words landed like a ledger that would not balance. She didn't ask for applause. She asked, with the plainness of someone who had spent nights waiting for a kindness she could repay in something other than coin, that Daniel make a different kind of investment. "Start with meals," she said. "Feed people who were hungry. Set up things that sustained, not only relieved. Share the kitchen's surplus rather than dump it. Hire where you can. Offer dignity where you have room." The request was as practical as it was moral. It required more than money. It required rearranging a life. Daniel's transformation did not happen in a single cinematic instant. It uncoiled through small, stubborn decisions that gradually reoriented his priorities. First, there were dinners, carefully planned at first, as if compassion were another department to manage. They began with his own restaurant's kitchen, where chefs he had once admired for the polish of their plates now peeled vegetables and portioned soup into containers that would be handed out at dawn. He sat in the back of vans distributing food, at first awkward with the levers of his own public image, then quiet and attentive as stories rose like steam from the styrofoam lids. A woman who had been a seamstress all her life and whose hands could no longer thread a needle. A man who sang to his grandchildren to drown out an old ache. He learned names, and with names came something that made the money on a balance sheet shrink in importance. Clara's recovery became a partnership in this new life. She found joy not in being cured alone, but in seeing people who had been invisible take their rightful places at a table. Her wheelchair gradually gave way to walks in neighborhood parks, to laughter that returned steady and strong. Together, they opened a modest program that matched surplus food with dignity. Invitations to sit at community tables where servers were volunteers, where conversation had no premium. They offered training and jobs within Daniel's business structures, creating pathways rather than charity that humiliated.
The company's annual reports began to show different line items, investments in human capital, not merely rows of profit. But more importantly, there were letters, notably no less valuable, thank you notes written on the back of grocery lists, drawings from children who had discovered that adults could change. The girl, whose name was never pinned down to one truth in their telling, observed these changes from the edges. Once, months into the new routine, she slipped through the service doors and stood quietly at the periphery of a feeding line, watching as volunteers handed out bowls and a server knelt to listen to a man describe how a hot meal had kept him alive another month. She nodded once, like a judge satisfied, and her eyes found Daniel. There was no sermon, no forced redemption in her gaze, only the recognition of a life altered. His conversion was not a denial of who he had been, it was a reconfiguration. He held on to the mind that could build and manage, but he remade the ends to which those skills were applied. He instituted policies that sent surplus meals to shelters instead of the dumpster. He partnered with community groups to create long-term programs. He employed some of the people who had once stood on the curb outside his restaurant. He learned that generosity could be engineered, not as a PR strategy, but as a routine. Daily lunches, outreach teams, a commitment that the kitchen would never again regard leftover food as disposable due to its lack of appeal. He started paying attention to the dignity of delivery, the way a meal was presented, the word used, the invitation extended, and saw how small changes restored pride.
Years later, what began as a single awkward dining room encounter became a tradition that reshaped the neighborhood. On the anniversary of that night, Daniel and Clara set a long table outside the restaurant. It was not a spectacle, it was a ritual. The table was heavy with breads, with stews that relinquished their steam like contented animals, with simple plates and clean cups. People sat who had once been strangers to one another. The young mother who had found paid work at the restaurant's new social enterprise, the elderly man who taught a weekly repair class, the homeless man who now led a neighborhood watch, not out of control, but out of care. The staff ate alongside them. The manager, who had once been ready to shoo the girl away, stood at the head of the table with a cloth in his hands, his posture softened by the practice of showing up. They spoke little of miracles at the table. The conversation concerned practicalities, meal schedules, volunteer rotations, which suppliers would donate extra goods, because truthfully, the thing that had impressed itself most on Daniel's heart was not the impossible cure alone, but the work that grew out of it. He had been healed in ways that were not visible on a medical chart. His empathy widened, his stubbornness softened into stubbornness of a different kind, the refusal to accept waste when people were hungry, the insistence that comfort not be hoarded. Clara, who had relearned walking in the mornings and had nights where her legs surprised her with strength, presided with a quiet amusement. When someone asked her later if she believed the girl was an angel, she smiled in a way that closed off no possibility and invited none. Was she? She asked back. Does it change what we do if she was or wasn't? Her answer held the deepest of truths. The source of the change was less important than the change itself. The community kept the girl's memory as one might keep a talisman, without fetishizing or sanctifying her into something untouchable. People spoke of a small hand that had started a reckoning. They taught their children to recognize hunger as a prompt to act, not as a moral lesson to be observed from the other side of a glass. Businesses that had once thought of surplus as rubbish learned to see it as resource. Volunteers who had come to fill an hour found themselves roped into years of service. There were skeptics, of course. Some said the cure was coincidence, or the girl a crafty performer who preyed on sentiment. Others insisted the whole story was an elaborate fabrication. Daniel took no pleasure in arguing for belief. He had kept ledgers and had known how to prove a profit. What he found himself telling friends instead, sometimes in the middle of quiet nights when he could feel the contours of his life reshaped, was this: something impossible had happened, and whatever its origin, it demanded a response. The choice, he learned, was not between believing a miracle and rejecting it. The choice was between doing nothing and letting an act of mercy change your life. On the next anniversary, as the long table stood set against the warm-lit facade of the restaurant and people came to sit regardless of where they slept at night, Daniel caught the eye of a young server handing out bread. The boy moved with an ease that testified both to training and to something deeper. He smiled at those he served, listened to their brief stories, acknowledged their presence. Daniel felt a peace settle over him, far heavier and far lighter than any balance sheet. "We were given a chance," he said aloud to no one in particular. "We were shown how to be better." Perhaps the girl had been an agent of the extraordinary. Perhaps she had been a projection of the need that always sits at the edge of comfort. The story did not require an answer to be true. The work that followed was the only verification anyone really needed. Food was given, jobs were created, systems changed. People's dignity, once eroded by anonymity, was returned in small rituals. A bowl handed with a name spoken, an offer to teach skill made without pity. Clara and Daniel walked the neighborhood, sometimes hand in hand, sometimes in silence, carrying the knowledge that a healed body had been the opening for a restored life. If you are hearing this story, ask yourself what you would do when the impossible shows up at your table. Would you hand over a piece of bread? Would you rearrange your life so that the things you discard become another person's sustenance? There is no single correct response, but there is a test. If a chance for compassion appears, and you can act without being asked to be rewarded, then perhaps a small revolution of the heart will begin. Years from that first night, someone would write in a note left on the community board, "We still set the table." The phrase was less ceremony than covenant, an ongoing commitment to remember that the miracle, if there had been one in the supernatural sense, had served to reveal a simpler, human truth. Healing is most complete when it includes repair of the social fabric that binds us. So when people asked Daniel in later conversations whether the girl had truly been an angel, he would pause. He would think of the warmth of bread in her hands, the sound of Clara's unexpected laugh, the faces that filled the long table each year. He never offered proof. He offered instead his life as evidence. The kitchens that worked not only for profit but for people, the jobs that gave dignity, the children who now learned to share. He had been a man who measured outcomes. Now he measured impacts. Whether or not the stranger at his table came from heaven, she had brought him back to earth. And perhaps that was the point. The impossible arrived, not to end mystery, but to start responsibility. The miracle, in whatever form it had worn, asked for an answer expressed in hands and policies and daily hospitality.
Daniel gave it, slowly, stubbornly, with the humility of someone who had been changed. In the end, the greatest proof lay not in the miraculous cure alone, but in the work that continued. A table, once set for a night, kept forever ready for anyone who knocked with an honest hunger. If the story pushes you, consider starting your own table, however small. Share food, time, or skill. The smallest gift, when offered with dignity, can be the hinge on which an entire life turns.